Jazz, Tim, a phenomenal year for maybe the peak. We probably said that in 1970, 1971, 1972. So maybe the peak for electric jazz. Because I'm looking at this list now. Miles on the Corner, Herbie Hancock's Mwandishi's Crossings, Return to Forever's first album, Les McCann's Invitation to Openness, Santana's Caravanserai, Weather Report, I Sing the Body Electric, Frank Zappa, Waka, Jawaka, Grand Wazoo. Interesting here, we've got bands that we're putting in the same category, some of which clearly have come from the tradition of pop and rock, Santana and Zappa, and some of which have clearly come from the tradition of traditional jazz. Miles, Herbie, Chick Corea. Interesting, they've kind of arrived at this similar point, isn't it? Because when you listen to Santana's Caravanserai, I'm struggling to say it, you can hear the difference between that and say what Miles Davis are doing is paper thin. I mean, obviously they both have very strong personality of their own, but it's become very close, isn't it? Is this the closest that jazz and rock ever came historically?
Well, I think in Britain, historically, you did have things like, let's say, Nucleus, Soft Machine, King Crimson. There was that sort of British jazz fusion, and the rock bands like Crimson and Soft Machine embracing jazz. And Brian Auger, I think he embraced jazz as well. So you did have times where they might be on the same marquee bill. It could be Keith Tippett and King Crimson. I'm inventing this, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
No one would have been surprised. But yeah, there's definitely a point here where this coalesces, where it's really difficult to tell the artists that have come from rock and the artists that come from jazz apart. Although I do think Miles, On the Corner is probably my favourite of these.
Well, yes. That On the Corner is something of its own.
Yeah.
Because it's Miles has introduced something new to his sound this year, which actually, as you're kind of saying here, does set it apart.
Yeah.
I think Caravanserai sounds more like what Miles would have been doing on
Exactly.
In a Silent Way, Bitches Brew, but in fact he's moved on, hasn't he? We've got a listener review of On the Corner, I think, haven't we, Rob? Let's have a listen to the listener review of On the Corner.
Hello, my name is Tam from Belgium. My choice was this complicated. For 1972 would be the absolutely freakadelic experience of Miles Davis's On the Corner, which could receive a distinction for one of the most bonkers fusion albums, basically taking the template of Bitches Brew, while stretching its abstract Afrofuturistic paintings to an almost breaking point. Of course, it's the one where all the usual suspects conspire to create a Stockhausen-inspired, telluric, mind-bending but also fascinating swamp of cut-up avant-funk.
Yeah, it's interesting that the listener there highlighted the Stockhausen influence, because Miles was very much enthralled to Stockhausen at the time, and also Paul Buckmaster, the arranger, was introducing him to a lot of very experimental Western 20th century classical music. It's Bitches Brew, but it's sicker, isn't it? It's got more distortion. It's got more dissonance. It's got more funk. It's dark. It's twisted. It's lo-fi. It's everything on this album is distorted into the red, isn't it? And it's repetitive. It's directionless, but it's got a spell and it's got a magic that holds you in its sway, hasn't it?
Again, something that kind of fits with krautrock, particularly Can and particularly aspects of Neu. It's relentless. And I think avant funk is a great description, but also battle funk, because it slaps you in the face straight off. It's really aggressive music. And I think what is interesting here, it's a bit like Bowie and Eno. Bowie and Eno, in a way, they partly paved the way for punk. By the time punk happens, Eno's doing ambient one, Bowie's away with kind of already inventing post-punk. They've already left it behind. At this stage, Miles has left In a Silent Way, he's left Bitches Brew, and in the wake of that, you've got Return to Forever, you've got Weather Report, Mwandishi, that are clearly following that template. Miles has left it completely. He's in another world.
This is the antithesis of slick, isn't it? This is not slick. The ones you mentioned before, and increasingly became. I love the Weather Report album from this year. I love the Return to Forever album. But there is a sense that as the 70s progressed, these bands became more and more slick. Whereas Miles is, as you say, is going into more dissonance, less slick. It's fascinating to hear musicians as well, isn't it, that are clearly able to shred with the best of them, being forced, quote unquote, to play this ugly, dissonant funk music.
Yeah.
There's almost a sense that they're being made to make this music under duress. You know what I mean? I almost hear that. They don't quite understand what Miles is asking them to do, but they're doing it anyway. Do you sense that too?
Yeah, and it's constantly, as you say, it's pushing the red. And I love the relentlessness of the rhythms. And you get that to an extent on I Sing the Body Electric, Weather Report, which is slightly cloudier, slightly more pastoral in places. Also has guest spot from Ralph Towner on that. But the second side, the Live in Tokyo side, where I think it's Eric Gravatt, the drummer, he is real powerhouse. And
yes.
This is pushed even further than Eric Gravatt on Live in Tokyo.
And also the repetition and funk.
And the repetition.
Relentlessness.
Which fits in. And the one thing I think is the biggest lie, I said about the biggest lie about prog rock is people say, oh, there was no humour or there were no roots influences. And you can dismiss that crass argument in a second. Similarly, one of the things I hate about criticism of Miles Davis in this period is he was courting the kids, partly because the cover has a kind of a funky contemporary look. This is as far from Sly, okay, it's got elements in common with Marvin Gaye and Sly and the Family Stone, but it's
got as many in common with Stockhausen.
Yeah, it's brutally uncompromising music.
Yeah.
This is not a middle-aged man trying to make friends with the kids. And I think, I've read Miles' biographies where they're saying, well, of course, he goes off into these commercial, crass directions.
Is that the Jack Chambers one? He hates everything that Miles Davis did that was electric.
I'm sorry, Jack Chambers is a great writer and a great thinker, but that is bollocks.
Yeah, well, clearly we don't agree with that, yeah.
But it's not. It's not commercial. In no universe is this an attempt to get the audience who fell in love with what's going on or the stylistics on your side.
The only caveat to that is I'll say, I think in part of his mind, Miles did think he was making something for the kids because he actually did try and release singles around this time.
Okay.
Is it the Little Green Frog or something? Which is a little through, and it sounds like a bit of On the Corner they've taken out. Why did you think that was a single? And I think actually he was so gone by this point, he actually thought that's what the kids wanted. But I like that. That makes me like it even more.
Yes.
That he was so deluded that he thought this was Down with the Kids, that this was completely what Stevie Wonder was doing and what War were doing. No, Miles. But wow, a timeless record, a record that sounds like nothing else.
It's extreme. And the only kind of influence, because what's interesting is, where has he set the template with, I think, Lifetime, Tony Williams, In a Silent Way, Bitches Brew, that sets the jazz fusion course. Mahavishnu, of course, reinforced that in 71. Yes. This one doesn't really. Miles is out on his own from this album. The only influence I can hear from this is I think John Martin uses elements on it in some of his early 70s and late 70s albums. He's got that kind of relentless funk, squall of noise approach. But I
think most of the other albums on this list, some fantastic records, that I mentioned already, the Mwandishi Crossings album, Returns Forever. They've got the Weather Report. They've got that kind of, like you say, they feel very informed by what Miles was doing a couple of years earlier. That kind of luminous Fender Rhodes with echo is kind of the signature sound of a lot of these records. And to be fair, a lot of the musicians involved in these records were in Miles' band and were partly responsible for creating that archetype in the first place. Whereas On the Corners, as you say, sounds nothing like that. Other records we've got this year, normally from the jazz fusion, Pharoah Sanders' Black Unity, very free, very confrontational, but still predominantly acoustic. Pharoah Sanders. He hasn't embraced electric instruments. And I think in a way that's made the music he's made from that period a lot more timeless than perhaps it might have otherwise been.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those great impulse recordings, isn't it?
It's quite an endurance. It's not quite the endurance that John Coltrane's Ascension is, but it's along those lines. It's a continuous 40-minute piece of free jazz squall in the tradition of John Coltrane's Ascension, which I personally like. Not for everyone.
I think Sanders is slightly more palatable, slightly more groovy.
Yeah, yes. Cannonball Adderley's Soul Zodiac, a concept album based on the Zodiac. Probably not the first concept. In fact, I think there's a famous album from the late 60s based on the Signs of the Zodiac. But this is the jazz equivalent. Again, the echoing Fender Rhodes, the echoing trumpet. I'm a sucker for it. And the voiceover here, the kind of voiceover talking about the Signs of the Zodiac. Scorpio. You are strong. You are attracted to Aries, Virgo.
Yeah,
I'm just such a sucker.
It's both brilliant and tacky. I think. I mean, the thing is, it is good. It's like great.
It's very
sort of
1972.
early 70s soundtrack music. But yes, it almost has that kind of collision with sexploitation and blaxploitation films as well.
Yeah, I love it for that. I absolutely adore it. A very British strain of Miles-informed music. Ian Carr's Belladonna, not released under the name of Nucleus, but a Nucleus album by
isn't it? Yeah.
There's something, without wishing to sound like a contradiction in terms, when you listen to Nucleus and Ian Carr, it's very clear the massive, massive influence of American music, isn't it? Miles Davis. And yet there's something also about it that's very British. And I don't quite know what that is.
I totally agree with you. And it's one of those things I've questioned as well, that when you listen to, say, Soft Machine of this period, Mike Westbrook of this period, Ian Carr of this period, it's very British. Not even European, it's very British. There's something quite woody about the sound of this music, and there's something in the melodies. And I can hear that he's influenced by Miles. And what I like about Ian Carr is that he never loses sight of the origins of the music, because when he's pushing at his most jazz rock fusion experimental with Nucleus, he'll throw in some licks from Louis Armstrong in the 20s. He's got a real knowledge of the genre. But I agree with you. There's something in the phrasing. Perhaps it's slightly more polite. I don't know.
There's one thing I think which is in the British jazz, which isn't in a lot of the American jazz, which is the use of time signatures and repetitive ostinatos in unusual time. I say that, I'm immediately thinking of Dave Brubeck now. But anyway, but generally speaking, you don't hear a lot of that in America. A lot of the British jazz...
Zappa did it a lot.
Zappa did it, yeah. Well, let's talk about Zappa. Two of my favourite Zappa albums from this year, Waka, Jawaka and Wazoo. This is the peak of his jazz influenced music, I think. And famously, of course, Zappa, the year before, had been knocked off stage
in London,
broken his back in London, or something, broken his back or twisted his back, or something, and was in a wheelchair, and reinvented himself with these records, which are very much in the tradition of jazz rock, and yet are very distinctively and very recognisably also Zappa records.
Yes.
Not just because of the occasional vocals, and the vocals are very occasional on these records. They are predominantly instrumental records. But there's something here, you recognise the tradition from earlier pieces like King Kong, a lot of improvisation, a lot of very interesting head arrangements. The chord voicings are very Zappa-esque, some interesting use of bizarre speeding up and slowing down sounds, using the studio to process the sounds, which are very Zappa-esque too. And I think these two might be certainly in my top 5 Zappa albums. These would both be in.
Yeah, I mean, great horn charts as well. Great trombone and trumpet playing on both of them.
Yeah.
Because the trombone at this stage was not a common solo instrument in rock music.
True.
I mean, it is Zappa in the sense that I think Waka Jawaka is the closest you get to pure fusion, but even that has the very tricksy, typically Zappa intro.
Yes, I mean,
before.
It's worth noting that album is subtitled Hot Rats 2, so it does feel like a continuation of... But even more, I think even more with the brass arrangements, it takes it even more into the realms of jazz.
Oh, it totally fits with... I mean, you know, when you had this category, it fits with what's happening in the worlds of jazz, sonically, as well as stylistically. I prefer Grand Wazoo. I think Grand Wazoo is slightly more compositional, if you like. It's not quite head arrangement and improv as much as Waka Jawaka. Waka Jawaka, especially the very long piece that, you know, opens the album, and you've got 2 very short songs.
I think you're thinking of Big Swifty. Big Swifty is the track that is the track that takes up the whole of side 1. Yeah. It's very much an improv piece.
Whereas I think that Grand Wazoo never loses sight of the melody and the arrangement.
It's a bit more structured and arranged.
Yeah. And I prefer Grand Wazoo because the thing is that he was a great melodist. You know, he was a great composer. And so there are some really strong, beautiful themes, and Grand Wazoo is my favourite of that.
And a Zappa melody is always instantly recognisable as a Zappa melody.
Yeah, completely. Whereas I think we're saying on Waka Jawaka, Big Swifty, that you have that immediate arrangement which is saying, right, this is Zappa, very tricksy, shifting time signatures and melodies, and then it goes for him into relatively simple
jam band,
but jazz rock band, jam band territory. But both, I agree, they're in the top tier Zappa for me. And, you know, push comes to shove, I'm going for Grand Wazoo over Waka, Jawaka. They're great.
One record I love from this year, jazz record, that I don't think you knew, Tim, but maybe you got a chance to check it out. Les McCann's Invitation to Openness. Did you get a chance to check that
I
one
did. I listened to it once on YouTube, which I think is the optimum way of listening to any album, with adverts coming in every few minutes.
Phenomenal record, although clearly very, very indebted to, again, to Miles. I mean, Miles really set the template for the next 2 or 3 years with Bitches Brew and In a Silent, I was going to say In Search of Space there, In a Silent Way. But a beautiful record. If you don't know it and you're a fan of Bitches Brew,
Good, yeah. 3 long songs.
3 very long open-end, very luminous kind of sound.
It is.
Fender Rose.
I mean, maybe more, it's somewhere between Bitches Brew and In a Silent Way, isn't it? Because it's more accessible than Bitches Brew, but maybe slightly more off the wall than In a Silent Way.
But completely up there in terms of the
really
sound.
good. But there were lots of, you know, lots of players around that era making great albums. Eddie Henderson being another one. But this is good, and I suppose Les McCann was never associated with this sort of music, which makes
is why I was surprised to discover this album.
more the extreme. But
I think it's an exceptional record.
It's really good. Yeah, I enjoyed it. And the thing is, I don't only really know Les McCann for his slightly more straightforward 60s work, but also for the fact that he had an album called Les Is More.
Great title.
Yeah.
Tim, we got one more category. One more category, because we need to return to progressive rock, because we're going to do progressive rock on the continent.
Okay.
Or progressive rock in continent, if you prefer.
Yeah, okay.
This is a mop-up.
Yeah.
It's a mop-up of the rest. One of my favourite bands of all time, Ange, debut album this year. They became better later on, but it's a great first entry in their discography. Focus 3. Focus fan. We talked about Focus on the show.
We've not really talked about Focus.
It's a very distinctive sound, didn't they?
Yeah,
very
great
unique
band. I mean, this is a double album that for me suffers for being a double album. I mean, I really like Hamburger
Concerto, yeah,
and Moving Waves. I think they're great records. This is amazing. I think there's enough music on this to make the best Focus album.
Well, the second record, if I remember right, is just a jam, isn't it?
Is it Anonymous? Is that
Anonymous? Yeah.
And I find that really wearing.
It's a bit directionless. Yeah. It's like, why did they make this a double album?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's some great stuff on it. It's got some of the best, and I suppose that's it. I find this really frustrating because it's Focus at their best with some of their strongest material. It ends with an earlier track, House of the King. You know, we all know from Sunday morning political TV.
I think that was
programs,
added because that's on the first album.
Yeah,
I think that was
exactly.
Added. Yeah,
it's
a very odd.
Was...
Yeah, it's a very odd thing to do, isn't it? I think it was probably aimed at what then was the market, the post Hocus Pocus market. That had the big hit with Hocus Pocus.
It's great. I mean, House of the King is really good.
House of the King is a great song.
And so, yeah, I'm really mixed with them. I love it. I think it's Focus at their best, but I really wish they'd have dropped Anonymous and the jamming.
Jan Ackerman, though, what a guitar player.
All of them, again.
Again, but I mean, for me, Jan Ackerman, one of the great, perhaps a little bit unsung guitar players. Furious style, frenetic, furious, but capable of incredible moments of lyrical beauty as well.
Well, this is it. They can do lyrical beauty. And I suppose that with Focus, they are, in my view, when they're at their best, they're first tier progressive rock. They are definitely, or I believe it's Premier League now.
So we've got, if we just stay in Holland for a minute, Super Sister putting on Gisteren. The closest Holland have, or the Netherlands have, beg your pardon, to a kind of Canterbury-esque sounding band. I really like them. Probably their best record, I think.
It sounds very, very Canterbury.
Very Canterbury-esque, very influenced, obviously, by the British Canterbury bands.
Distorted Hammonds and kind of quite Richard Sinclair lead vocal.
Yeah.
None more English, despite them being Dutch.
Well, yes, and a lot of, you talked about comedy in progressive rock. A lot of humour and comedy and sort of, undermining their own seriousness. Then in Scandinavia, we have the Finnish band Tasavalan Presidenti with their classic Lambert land. Scandinavian progressive rock is a whole other area which we don't really have time to go into, but this is one of the archetypal records of Scandinavian progressive rock, which was a very unique sound. It sounds very Scandinavian, at the risk of stating the obvious, but it also has this very gentle jazz influence as well, R&B influences. Bo Hansen will probably be the most well-known Scandinavian sort of progressive crossover. Pekka Pahola less so, but I think Bo Hansen had big hits in the UK, didn't he?
Well, they're interesting. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the Finnish scene in particular is that there was a lot more jazz than is typical for other continental prog scenes.
They did like their jazz.
And they really like their Zappa.
But that's also true of, I think, Scandinavia generally. Yeah. Sorry, did you say Finland?
Yeah, I'm saying
Sweden.
Finland, but no, you're probably right.
If you listen to
overall.
Swedish progressive rock bands, Danish progressive rock bands, Norwegian progressive rock bands, there is a strong influence, I think, from jazz. I mean, a lot of jazz musicians ended up living in Stockholm, making records in Stockholm.
But and Zappa as well, because I think Hot Rats was a massive
King
hit
Kong
there,
was
it?
covered by so many. Tasavalan Presidenti covered King Kong.
Right.
I think some other the Finnish progressive.
But that's what's interesting, isn't it? So that Germany, Italy, Holland, and then Scandinavia, they're developing threads of progressive music that are quite distinct from one another.
Much so. Keith Jarrett famously had his Scandinavian quartet as well with Jan
Okay.
Garbarek. I said earlier, I think, that there are 2 progressive rock albums for me this year. Close to the Edge is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the other one that I would take to my grave. Aphrodite's Child, 666,
Okay.
is an absolute masterpiece for me. Absolute masterpiece. Now, we talked about, again, we come back to this subject time and time again, about progressive rock, the first wave being a product of nothing but itself. In other words, musicians just drawing from all of these different places to create this new hybrid. This is a Greek band. Vangelis is the composer. Demis Roussos is the singer, who became very famous in the 70s in the UK for being this kind of middle-of-the-road singer. But the time was a kick-ass bass player.
Great bass player.
In a
great vocalist. He's a first-class vocalist.
This album is mad, isn't it? It's a concept album based on the Book of Revelation, and it takes in everything. It takes in everything from traditional Greek music to furious Mahavishnu-like fusion. And famously, this extraordinary piece of, I don't know how you describe it. It's almost like something that Luciano Berio would have done, this kind of performance art with a vocalist, this piece called Infinity.
Yeah, isn't it a famous Greek actress or singer who does that?
Yeah,
as well?
and she performs these possessed solo vocal. Well, it has percussion and vocal. And it's this piece that's supposed to signify the ending of the earth.
Ritualistic, isn't it? Very.
It's absolutely possessed. Like I said, it's something that Luciano Berio would have composed for his wife, Kathy Barbarian, or something Yoko Ono would have done, or it's absolutely possessed. It's got nothing to do with the tradition of progressive rock. It's got everything to do with the tradition of theatre, performance art, and yet it's part of this concept album. And there are moments that you'll recognise instantly. Oh, that's archetypal Vangelis. But there are other moments. There are other moments on this album that are like nothing else I think he did.
No, but there's some great pop songs. I think this is the thing.
Great pop songs.
It is really eccentric, to say the least. But it does have some great, almost kind of post-60s pop. You can hear that there's kind of Hendrix in there sometimes.
Four
as well.
Horsemen is the classic on
Four
the record.
Horsemen is really good.
What a track.
I mean, one of the
Break.
flaws for me on the album is they don't allow Demis Roussos to sing more of the material because he
Right.
is such a good vocalist. And the last track is great as well. The beautiful
Break.
last track. But what's hilarious, isn't that the track where it's quite poignant, it's a really strong ballad, and then Vangelis is in the background doing some weird scat, undermining it, almost in a Zappa-like way.
No, I think it's the way singing. Yeah, I think it's beautiful.
Okay.
It's beautiful. I think it is the
I
singer.
think he's undermining it.
It's the
as a joke.
drummer singing that song.
It's the drummer
I think.
singing that song, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's great. I mean, the track is great. And you're right, it kind of goes from avant-garde to post-Tommy 60s rock to psychedelia.
Cosmic music.
To cosmic music.
Aegean Sea, what a
the
track.
birth of Vangelis, you're right.
Birth of Vangelis, yeah.
Really interesting.
Weird kind of experimental percussion pieces.
Yeah.
I think they're basically using whatever they can to try and channel the story.
It's a bit of a consequences of an album in some ways.
It
isn't
is,
it?
because probably some of it people would find completely impenetrable.
Yeah, and I think there was a single album version done at one point for one market. But from what I can gather, it was Vangelis wrote all of the music, and the lyrics were written by a film director. And I think the concept is that it's a circus that is going around performing the apocalypse,
Right.
while the apocalypse is happening all around in real time.
Wow, I didn't know that. I mean, the use of voices on this record is amazing. And
I might be confusing that with another progressive
not
concept
just
album,
singing
but-
voices, but narrated voices. There's that track "Loud, Loud, Loud," which is it was spoken by this American.
That's really good, isn't it? Yeah,
It's
great
completely,
voice.
It's completely magical.
Yeah.
And then between each stanza, it says loud, 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 loud. This very kind of soporific choral voice, just repeating this refrain. It's hypnotic.
It is beautiful.
It's a magic. I mean, I use this word a lot. I know. I use it in relation to Zeit. I use it in relation to Hawkwind. There's a sense of otherness about this, and it might have something to do with the fact that they're Greek. that there is always this tradition of the history and the sound and the culture of Greek music.
But it draws in all sorts of things. I think some of the lyrics are inspired by the Paris hippie riots and so on of 68. And there's this weird thing running through the album, which you say it's kind of magical and trance-like, which it is, but then you have this very English voice going, all the seats are occupied.
Oh, yes.
In a kind of Stephen Burkoff way,
Yes.
before tracks, or loud, loud, loud.
Well, I love that. So
Davros.
So there's bits in the between tracks. So the tracks will kind of all flow together.
Yeah.
So a track will start to fade out, and then an English voice will come over and it will say, "That was the wedding of the lamb.
Yeah.
Now comes the capture of the beast." It's like little introducing. I love that though. That's so weird.
But who thought that was a good idea?
Vangelis. It was a good idea.
It is a good idea.
The
We're
Battle
talking about
of
it
the
now.
Locusts.
Yeah.
Do it. Love that
Yes,
stuff.
that one.
Love
Do
that
it.
st- Do it. I love
Of course,
that stuff.
I am doing it in a mad Stephen Burkoff goes Davros, but you know what I mean. You probably did a more accurate version, actually.
I absolutely love that about the album. I mean, the one flaw of the album is the fourth side. They made a double album. They clearly ran out of steam a bit. The fourth side, all the seats were occupied. It's this 19-minute long, a bit directionless jam.
Yeah.
But then it ends with that beautiful track break at the end.
Yeah, which is really good.
It's the only flaw on the record for me is that fourth side gets a bit too loose and indulgent. But there is nothing else like it under the sun. Aphrodite's Child 666, one of the greatest progressive concept albums of all time.
It's a one-off, and then, of course, it becomes ever more fascinating that Vangelis partly then, becomes the sort of film's soundtrack composer of his generation and making his solo albums, which are great.
He does actually make a sequel to his album Earth, which he made the following year, is a very close cousin to 666.
Okay.
Yeah.
Although he did one, I think, about a year before this, which is more pastoral and with trumpet. It's a really lovely album.
There's so many great, beautiful albums, and there's so many different aspects to his musical personality. I'm a big fan of his albums like Boborg and Invisible Limits, very experimental.
Well, Heaven and Hell I quite like.
Heaven and Hell, it's more his proggy thing, and he's got the electronic albums like Spiral and China. Just one of the greats, of the greats, and of course his film soundtracks. Blade Runner for me, I'll still hold up as.
There's one album he did in 1980, which was almost his kind of equivalent of an electro-pop album, but very
See You
strange.
Later.
See You Later.
Great album.
Really underrated, I think. And totally up to the minute in terms of the technology and sound.
Very much.
Really good.
I think partly because he kind of because he never toured. He kind of almost existed in his own little bubble.
Yeah.
So he always felt like he was just in his own world, his own bubble. Some of the albums he made in the 80s are fantastic. Soil Festivities, Mask, amazing records.
The point is, for such an ambitious experimental composer and artist, that he left his mark on everyone. My dad bought Vangelis albums because, of course, Blade Runner.
Well,
not Blade
Chariots
Runner.
of Fire.
Sorry, Chariots of Fire.
Chariots
What
of
was I saying?
Fire,
He didn't buy Blade Runner. It was me who bought Blade Runner.
Chariots of Fire.
Chariots of Fire.
Yeah.
Very and this,
iconic.
Could be the first song that many people learn on piano and so on. It's but he touched an awful lot of people so outside of his world.
He did. Also with Blade Runner, I think a lot of people discovered Vangelis music or Vangelis. Vangelis music through.
Is it Vangelis or Vangelis? I don't know.
I think it's Vangelis, but Americans I hear
they call it Vangelis.
Vangelis. Maybe that's also right. Let's move on to Italy. We're moving across the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Am I getting my geography right there? Across the Mediterranean to I hope I'm getting my geography.
Get a
there.
map of Europe. Have a look.
We're in the home straight now, Tim. We're in the home straight. We've just got a couple more albums to finish to talk about, and then we finish.
We've not ended on jazz. We're ending on Italian symphonic.
We've done
Prog.
jazz. Well, I deliberately did that because we always end up on jazz. So not today.
I'm missing
Not today. Although we are going to end up on a controversial one, I think.
Okay, go on.
The one that we're not going to agree on anyway. Italy. Franco Battiato. Fetus. No, talk about Vangelis being a completely unique artist.
Yeah.
Here's an artist. This is very odd. It's a very Italian thing to do this, apparently, because I don't think he's the only one in Italy. I can't remember the name. There's another artist that had a similar kind of career trajectory where they started out as a very kind of middle-of-the-road pop artist. Then they went down this incredibly experimental rabbit hole, came out the other end and started making Eurovision pop and being one of the biggest stars in the world.
Yeah.
In Italy. And that in a nutshell is the history of Franco Battiato. In fact, there's a German equivalent, Achim Reichel. Anyway, but I digress.
I think it's a Portuguese equivalent as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Franco Battiato. It's difficult to think of an English equivalent. Someone who started out middle of the road.
It's a bit like if Cliff Richard had started with Tales of Topographic Oceans and then went to Celebrations.
No. He'd started doing Living Doll and move it, then gone through the 70s making Tales from Topographic Oceans and King Crimson's Lizard.
Yeah.
And then come out the other end basically...
You're right, Lizard, it's strange stuff, this.
And then come out the other end basically, well, as Cliff Richard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as Cliff
Chaz
Richard.
and Dave, you know, from Tales from Topographic Oceans. It's a bit like that. But that is the career trajectory of Franco Battiato. Although that's a bit unfair because I think Battiato is very, very highly respected.
He's highly respected. I think one of the things that we miss is he's highly respected as a poet as well, that people really
not sure.
rate.
Are you saying Cliff is not highly rated as a poet?
I mean, he should be. Wired for Sound is a great...
Yeah, I like
great
it.
track.
Anyway, so this whole point about this guy, Franco Battiato, is that starting in 1972 with this album, Fetus, he made a string of very, very experimental, strange albums, to the point that when they were all reissued a few years ago, they were reissued as, they had a series title of The Experimental Years.
Yeah.
To kind of recognize the fact this was a very distinctive period in his career where he was very curious, very experimental, very progressively minded. It's progressive, but it's not. It's musique concrète. It's, I don't know, it's got a music hall sensibility sometimes. It's got sound design. It's got avant-garde classical music going on here. It's got proto-synthesizer experiments.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's very interesting. It's used as synth.
Yeah.
I think, you know, again, if you're trying to explain it to somebody who's never heard it before, there are certain elements with the more hysterical aspects of early Bowie, because he can go into a kind of acoustic guitar bits as well, can he not?
Yes,
and Hamill.
Yeah.
So there are kind of pretty acoustic. So there's a kind of Hamill or Bowie's most hysterical element. There's also a kind of Floydian quality sometimes in his use of sound and pace. But you're right, that's about it, you know. And it has a progressive nature in that they're conceptual. I think the second album was Pollution, was it?
Yeah.
So the first couple of albums are conceptual works. And after this, he goes even more out there. He does albums like Click that are
more minimalist. I think the
very
influence of
minimalist.
minimalism and repetition comes in, and he's using a lot more ostinato figures. Here, it's not. It's very fragmented, very broken. It's a little snatch, like you say, almost little snatches of songs.
Yeah.
And then they'll dissolve into some weird experimental synth thing, and then it'll go into some sound effects sequence. Then it'll go back to the little fragment of song that you heard 5 minutes earlier. And it's all kind of put together in this fascinating continuum. I mean, the albums are not long. They're quite succinct. They're like 15 minutes, like 30 minutes long. Yeah. But they take on a really interesting journey, a really interesting ride. And I think more than anything else that we've talked about from this year, this album is the one that makes me understand the prevailing kind of atmosphere of the time. You can do anything.
Yeah.
You can go into a recording studio and you can be as experimental and curious, and it doesn't matter. All bets are off. You can try anything. It's almost like the Battiato Fetus album is the one that tells me this more than maybe this and the Aphrodite's Child album. All bets are off. Fuck it. Let's do everything. Let's bring that in. Let's bring that. Yeah, let's have 30 seconds of a little pop song, but then let's dissolve into a sound effects bit, and let's have a experimental electronic. And it's all on this record, and it's all on this record in the space of about 3 minutes. I think that's the fascinating thing about it.
Oh, it's extraordinary. You know, he is an extraordinary artist to be one of a country's favourite artists, and even more extraordinary that he goes from this to more minimalist to Eurovision. And I did some work with an Italian singer called Alice, and she worked with Battiato. I think even did an album of Battiato pieces as well, and she held him, you know, in great esteem. So he is, you know, he certainly was a legend in Italy, and deservedly so. And I'm kind of, you know, again, envious that someone could put these albums out and be a household name in a country.
It's amazing. You know? It's amazing, and it is difficult to think of an equivalent in British terms. I don't think the British people or the British media would not allow someone like that to do that.
No, and there is no equivalent, because I mean, of course, there are elements of Bowie, elements of Hamill, because, you know, I think when Hamill starts working with kind of Magog sort of territory and so on.
Listen to that on the way here today. What a track. Yeah.
Extraordinary music. But actually, you've got a few sensible songs tucked away at different ends of the album. It's a different experience. The Battiato experience, as you say, things happen so quickly and dissolve into something else.
But it's almost like, I suppose the equivalent would be almost like if Peter Hamill had made all those records in the 70s and then in the 80s had kind of transitioned into being George Michael.
Yeah, exactly. But and also we miss some of the references.
Which wouldn't happen, would it? Which just wouldn't happen in the UK.
No, you know, it's like the idea of him representing us at Eurovision, you know, rather than Bucks Fizz.
What would that sound like, Tim? Save all
Making your mind up!
Love
I
it.
think.
Save all your kisses for me in Ham style.
Save all your kisses for me.
Oh, brilliant. In an alternate reality, that would have been so good. Anyway, yeah, Franco Battiato, we love this album. And again, I think maybe we talk about the quintessential album years albums. This is one of them, isn't it? This is one of them.
Yeah,
Franco
definitely.
Battiato's Fetus. This is a phenomenal piece of art, and one that probably a lot of people outside of Italy, maybe even people in Italy, have never come across. Even though they would know the name very well, they may not know these records he made.
Yeah.
What about PFM, Premiata Forneria Marconi? I think I'm right in saying that most of the material on these albums was refashioned with UK lyrics written by Pete Sinfield for a couple of British language albums, which are called Don't Tell Me, Photos of Ghosts, and The World Became the World. Am I right?
You're pretty much right on that. Yeah, Photos of Ghosts combines what I think they thought of as the best of these two albums.
Okay.
Plus, I think there's an extra. There's a short, lovely instrumental on it. And I really like that. I think Pete Sinfield actually did some great work around this time. You know, I love Lizard, as you know, his last...
We all love Lizard.
You know, we love Lizard. Obviously, he did Ireland as well. But I love the Roxy album. I love Photos of Ghosts. And his own solo album from 73 still, I think, is... you know, a bit of a neglected classic, very lovely record. So yeah, he produced Photos of Ghosts, which I think is really quite nice. These two albums, I guess, you know, it's an Italian band drawing from aspects of Genesis, Yes, ELP, Tull in parts, but doing it really well. They've got a very delicate quality at times, which I like a lot. Apart from When the World Became the World, which has an almost kind of Crimson-esque...
I think if I have a problem
anger.
with PFM is it's too easy to hear what their record collection is very often.
Maybe.
World Became the World sounds like In the Court of the Crimson King to me. Some other tracks sound like the very pastoral, 12-stringy, pastoral, you know, Genesis-y. Then there's the synth parts, the very ELP-y. They've got a slightly more furious jazz fusion aspect going on sometimes, which I like, I enjoy. I do like these records, but they do sound like a product of listening to a lot of British archetypes.
Yes, although I think the vocals give it a very definitive character of its own.
Right, I do like the records. Here's a record I don't like. In fact, this is the last record we're going to talk about in 1972. Il Balletto di Bronzo, Is. You like this, Tim? I don't like it at all.
It's a progressive masterpiece.
It's so overwrought and so hysterically over the top. I find it slightly ridiculous. But I know it has its fans, and you are one of them. So try and describe this album to us, Tim.
Well, I think one of the things that is interesting is that Van der Graaf Generator's Pawn Hearts, which is an extraordinary, uncompromising album, was #1 in Italy for a very, very long time. And Hamel and Van der Graaf had an enormous impact on the Italian music scene. This is perhaps the most explicit. I mean, Little May had elements of it, but this is the most explicit Van der Graaf, Hamel, Pawn Hearts influenced album of that progressive Italiano.
See, I can't hear that at all.
It's really extreme in parts, quite dissonant. It has those kind of, I think, satanic riffs. There's one bit that I think is amazing where it just has this kind of quite slight groove. It's kind of like a bass groove, minor key bass groove. And the piano is very Mike Garson. And it actually sounds a lot like David Bowie's Outside in places, or the stranger parts of Aladdin Sane by David Bowie.
So you're saying to the folks they should go and... Folks, go and check this. I know I've directed the listeners, I should say, to a lot of albums that they've ended up hating.
Yeah?
Yeah, I know I've done that. Probably more than you've done that. I've done that.
Il Balletto di Bronzo Is.
Tim is recommending you go and listen to Il Balletto di Bronzo's Is.
Yeah, so imagine ELP from Hell meets Pawn Hearts.
No, but that makes it sound too...
with elements of David Bowie's more experimental music to come.
Yeah, but see, that sounds like my perfect album.
This is your perfect album.
It's awful. It's awful. It's awful. Sorry.
I like it, and they look great as well.
I don't particularly like it.
Okay.
There's a lot about the Italian progressive rock bands that doesn't appeal to me. It is the operatic sensibility. The reason I love the German music, for all the reasons we mentioned, the reason I don't like the Italian, some of the Italian bands anyway, is that tradition of the more operatic.
There's a melodrama.
Overwrought melodrama, yes.
There is a melodrama.
But obviously the Italians, they love their opera. Listen, they've always
and that's what I
embraced,
mean.
They've always embraced our music over the years as well.
So I've got a fondness even for, Banco, Area, L'Orme. They did an album, Contrapunti, if you know that one. Their 74 album, really interesting.
I love Aria. I love Arti and Misteri, or however you say their name. I love a lot of Italian music. Maurizio Bianchi, industrial, is one.
You love Battiato.
Some of the sickest industrial music you'll ever hear. Battiato, big fan. Just not so much a fan of the more symphonic, operatic strain of Italian progressive music.
I think they do it well in the way that Focus do. Focus in some ways really fit very nicely with that British explosion of progressive music, and some of the Italians do. Really, Photos of Ghosts sat nicely with Foxtrot in the record collections.
There's another fascinating Italian, Claudio Rocchi, I think his name is.
I think I know the name.
He kind of also started off making these very experimental records and gradually transitioned to be more of a sort of a pop icon. But they seem to have this career trajectory where you can start off making very experimental music, and it's okay for you to gradually transition into being more, kind of more of a sort of family artist, if you like.
You're right.
Thank God that didn't happen.
In the way that the
Balletto di
French,
Bronzo.
the French, I think, had a thing where a lot of musicians were also actors and writers. That was kind of interesting. There was a few, they had multiple groups. And there were great French albums this year. Brigitte Fontaine does a fantastic album. Serge Gainsbourg's arranger, Jean-Claude Vanier, fantastic cinematic album. There's really interesting music.
By the way, that album to me you were telling me about Pete Sinfield earlier still that you think's really good. Is that why you keep giving it to me over the years?
Still?
Yeah, you've given it to me about 3 times.
I've
said, I don't want that, you have that.
I've got a copy.
Yeah, you'll be giving it to me soon.
It might end up in a blind bag. That's true.
I've never kept it either, to be fair, but I'm not claiming
the problem
it's
is
good.
with my collection, where obviously I'm still sort of buying and listening and so on, but I'm actually going for that Mark Hollis thing of leading towards silence, where gradually everything is going where just a tiny note offends me.
You're just going to be left with one John
Martin
album.
And I will be left with one John Martin
Moon.
Song, one single.
You'll just be left
and
with
Pink Moon.
You'll be left with Pink Moon by Nick Drake, and that's it.
I'll be staring at a wall weeping.
Yeah.
And then even that will be too much.
Well, that's
I'll
fine.
Throw my original island copy of Pink Moon at you outside of my window.
Well, that's fine. So the 2030
even
edition,
I'm staring at the wall.
The 2030 edition of the album years will be Tim talking about the one song that he knows. Yeah.
It'll be down to the one note that I like.
So, Tim, let's wrap it up there. I'm already noticing some albums that we've managed to skip over. We've managed to skip over Keith Jarrett, Expectations Facing. We didn't talk about Ornette Coleman. We didn't talk. But let's just draw a veil across 1972.
This is a cruel year.
A cruel year? Why cruel?
Because there's so much.
There's so much. It's
bringing out the worst in us. We're rambling.
So we're
losing our focus.
I'm looking at the clock here in the Crystal Spotlight podcast recording room, and it's. Even the clock is looking weary at this point. Yeah, it's exhausted.
We've got sick during the course of this.
Can we not? In the next episode, can we just do a year where everything is shit and we hate everything? Yeah. We've said that before, haven't we?
We have said that.
We haven't done it. We haven't followed up on it though. We just pick a year that everything we hate everything, or we just don't know anything about anything. We just have the readers review everything. Tim.
And we nod our heads.
Talking about cruelty, I'm going to be very cruel now because I'm going to ask you to pick. Don't do what you always do. So it's so hard. It's so hard. I know it's hard. Pick. Okay, let's say you're allowed to pick 3 albums from this year that you would take to a desert island from the year 1972, and then we'll move on to the most influential. That's going to be hard, isn't it? Most influential record from 1972. What are you going to say? Do you want me to give you some clues? You're going to say Roxy Music. You're going to say Pink Moon. And you can say Close to the Edge. Am I right? 3 out of 3?
You're pretty close. I mean, I don't know, because For the Roses,
I knew you'd say that
very,
one too.
very.
Yeah, I'd say you're allowed. Lovely. You're allowed as many as you like. As many as you like.
Yeah, I mean, Pink Moon is the greatest Drake achievement in some ways.
Today it is. Tomorrow it will be Brighter Later, and the day after it will be
and I really like the oppressive, brutal battle funk of On the Corner as well.
Me too. That's
and I do think Close to the Edge is the greatest progressive rock album of all time. So that should be in my list.
If you discount Dark Side of the Moon,
I prefer Dark Side. There's something about Dark Side of
the Moon. I'm not sure Dark Side of the Moon
to me more.
But Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd kind of occupy a different place.
Yeah, no, you're probably right.
If you're talking about the classic progressive rock tropes, Close to the Edge is the definitive album for me.
As I was coming here, I was going to give you one answer. I was going to be really, really succinct.
Go on then.
I was going to go with Roxy Music by Roxy Music because it covers so much ground.
Right.
It's exciting, it's beautiful, it's chaotic, it's hooky, it's rootsy, it's futuristic. It's a great record.
Well, I was going to perhaps suggest that as one of the albums you could say is the most influential, except the caveat to that is, of course, as I think you pointed out when we talked about it, it's a hard thing to imitate.
Yeah,
it's a hard thing to imitate. Okay, is that your
for what, Roxy Music?
Roxy, Nick Drake, Close to the Edge, For the Roses,
On the Corner.
On the Corner. That's 5. That's a pretty good 5. That's a pretty good 5. I mean, again, that could easily be my 5 too, but I'm going to go with Tangerine Dream Zeit, of course, as my all-time number 1.
It's got to be one then.
It's got to be my number 1. Close to the Edge, definitely. I love The Slider by T-Rex.
It's a great album. It's a really, I mean, that's a strong album. There's not really a misstep on it, is there?
No, brilliant. I think it's the peak of Bolan. Aphrodite Child 666, I have to have.
Yeah.
Just phenomenal. I wouldn't put the Joni album in my best of the year. I love it, but to me, it's not quite up there with Hejira, Blue, those kind of albums.
No, it isn't.
Noi. I love the Noi album. Absolutely adore it. And actually, I was going to say maybe the Noi album could be a candidate for most influential as well.
I was going to go for Noi as most influential in that I can still hear it in experimental indie bands now, but definitely you could hear it, 70s and 80s post-punk wouldn't exist without Halagallo and Negativland.
And also Sabbath Volume 4, although you could pick any of the first 6 Sabbath albums and say, these are the albums which inform almost all
they're great. I've just got a real soft spot for Sabotage.
Me too. I mean, I wouldn't pick 4 as my favourite. So although I love it, I think it's an influential record. Probably Black Sabbath, the first album is the one that really set the template.
That's also got the best cover, I think.
It's got the best cover of all. In fact, Tangerine Dream Zeit is my favourite album. Black Sabbath's first album has got my favourite album cover.
But there are so many here because if I'm talking about best songs of the year, something like Dust.
Beautiful
from the Fleetwood
song.
Mac and one of the great covers of this era. And as we've said, I think that, when we listen to the Brazilian album, Milton Nascimento, exquisite.
Yeah, loved that too. Loved that too. So many great records. Well, there you go, folks. That's 1972. And thank you for the listeners' reviews on this episode. I think that worked pretty well. They were all fantastic. Pretty much chimed with what we felt too, which is always good. I'm looking forward to the ones that don't, just because it will make for an interesting discussion, that if somebody has a very different view of us. But I think today, generally, we were in accord with the reviewers, so that's good.
Yeah, I think that's true. And obviously, as we always must end, please press that like button.
Oh, yes, sorry, yeah. Please, if you like our podcast, give us a review.
Yeah, do it in a mechanical way.
And recommend us to your chums. Is that right? Is that what
I think so.
Recommend it to your chums, yeah. Okay, thank you very much, folks. We'll be back with another year soon. I don't know what it's going to be yet, did we, Tim? We haven't decided yet.
We haven't, although I think we're going to do 1982 at some point.
We do want to do 1982 at some point. We like to do things in tens, don't we? So 1972, 1982, we've done that before. We may do that again. Thank you very much for watching, for listening. Goodbye from me and goodbye from Tim.
Goodbye.